in the grand halls of 19th century London, where glittering chandeliers lit feasts for the elite, a butler silently watched as cruelty was served alongside wine. But one night, the servant turned master of the table, carving a new kind of banquet no guest would ever forget. What happens when the man forced to serve finally decides it's time to be served justice? April 12th, 1820. The city of London trembles with the clamor of horse-drawn carriages clattering across slick cobblestones, the muffled roar of markets winding down as twilight leaks into the crooked alleys. The Thames exhales a sour mist, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke, refuse, and the faint brine of the docks. That night, high society gathers under the gleam of chandeliers, their silks and jewels catching fire in the candlelight of a manner that will, before dawn, be remembered for horror. The date is stamped in the newspapers of the age as nothing more than another evening of wealth on display. But behind the carved oak doors of the Harrington estate, a story is already taking shape that would outlive even the wealthiest names carved into family crests. The house itself towers over the lane, all stone arches and pointed gables, flanked by wrought iron gates sharpened like fangs. From the outside, its windows glow golden, promising warmth, refinement, and laughter. From within, however, the warmth is a cruel performance, for there is a man who moves through its polished corridors like a shadow, unseen except when his labor is required. His name, seldom spoken in kindness, is Elias. He was born far away from this island nation, in a village along the western coast of Africa, where the sea once touched his ankles, and his grandmother's voice told stories of gods who walked among men. That was before raiders, before chains, before the dark belly of a ship stole him across the ocean and deposited him into the cold embrace of English servitude. He has lived in silence, his memories a forbidden treasure. He touches only in solitude, for here in this land his voice is deemed dangerous, his presence tolerated only as utility. Elias wears the livery of a butler, his figure tall, straight-backed. The only thing betraying his exhaustion, the fine tremor in his hands when he allows them to rest. To the Harringtons, he is not a man, but a fixture. The silent bearer of wine, the one who polishes silver until it gleams with a reflection so sharp one might almost see the truth of themselves within it. Yet his silence has never been emptiness. It is a well of observation, and every cruel word, every smirk, every humiliation has been swallowed down and stored there, where it ferments into something far stronger. The master of the house, Lord Reginald Harrington, presides over tonight's banquet. His jowls quiver when he laughs, his waistline overflowing his velvet waistcoat, his hands heavy with rings. He is a man who prides himself on his generosity to guests while feeding upon the dignity of those who serve him. He delights in reducing Elias to spectacle, a curiosity paraded for amusement, a living reminder of conquest and ownership. See how he carries himself, Harrington once bragged to his circle of acquaintances, as obedient as a hound, and twice as clever if you keep him fed just enough. The guests who arrive tonight are of a similar breed, men and women lacquered in powder and perfume, pearls strung around necks, feathers arching over powdered wigs. They are merchants swollen with profits from colonial trade, officers who recall with pride their expeditions abroad, ladies whose lips curl at the sight of anything outside their gilded sphere. The room fills with the scents of roasted pheasant and sugared almonds, the notes of a string quartet fluttering like delicate birdsong above the chatter. The laughter is loud, careless, the laughter of people who believe the world was built to cradle them alone. Elias glides among them, silent as breath, pouring ruby wine into crystal goblets, setting down platters carved with glistening meat. His uniform itches against his skin, but he wears it like armor, concealing the storm beneath. As he leans to refill the glass of Sir Edmund Clark, a portly man with whiskers powdered with sugar, Clark sneers, "Careful, boy, don't spill. Your kind stains things so easily." The table erupts in laughter, and Harrington smirks, his eyes glinting as if he relishes the performance. Elias bows his head, his face expressionless, but inside a quiet ember flares brighter. He remembers his grandmother's words, murmured beside a fire long ago, words about patience, about the spirits that watch and wait for balance to be restored. The ember grows each time the laughter slices him, each time he feels his humanity stripped for sport. He has lived too long in silence, but silence is not surrender. Silence is preparation. The contrast of worlds is suffocating. Around him, velvet curtains pool like spilled wine against marble floors. Crystal catches candlelight in 1,000 sparks. The guests gorge themselves, voices thick with wine, crumbs clinging to their lips. And yet Elias tastes nothing. Not the food he serves, not the air heavy with perfume. What he tastes is iron, the flavor of restraint gnawed down to the root. For years he has been invisible, a man who moves without acknowledgement, who exists only as long as his service continues. But tonight, under the weight of their sneers and the clatter of their gluttony, something shifts. He watches the master raise a glass, watches the guests lean in like jackals at a feast, and he feels the ember inside become a spark. He knows now that the world of chandeliers and polished silver is not untouchable. It can be cracked, it can be carved open, and if he must be the one to wield the knife, then so be it. The night stretches long, each moment layering insult upon insult. Harrington calls him over, demanding Elias recite a toast in his accent for amusement. And when Elias refuses with the excuse of servile humility, Harrington chuckles darkly, patting his cheek as though he were a child. The guests roar with laughter, pounding their goblets on the table. Elias bows, retreats, and in that bow there is both obedience and a hidden vow. He disappears into the kitchen, the heavy door swinging shut behind him, and the noise of the banquet muffles into a dull hum. In the silence of the kitchen, lit only by the orange glow of the hearth, Elias exhales. The ember burns steadily now, no longer a flicker. The night that began with laughter will not end the same. The wind outside rattles the shutters, carrying with it the cold scent of rain. Upstairs, crystal clinks, voices rise, and the house swells with careless joy. But below, in the kitchen shadows, Elias sharpens a blade. The banquet continues above as though the night could never sour, each laugh booming through the beams, each clink of glass a mockery of hunger elsewhere in the city. Elias stands at the edge of the kitchen table, the knife in his hand catching the orange glow of the fire. Its edge whispers as he tests it against his thumb, not drawing blood, not yet, only feeling the promise of what lies within its sharpness. For years he has held blades only to carve meat for others, to slice bread he would never taste, to serve hands that stripped him of dignity. Now, in the weight of the steel, he feels not servitude, but possibility. He breathes deeply, steadying the rhythm of his chest, and as he breathes, he hears again the laughter above, a laughter that once crushed him, but tonight only fuels the fire. He remembers the moment that lit the ember earlier, the humiliation of Harrington's mock toast. But it is not the first time his soul has been ground beneath their heels. He recalls the sting of a whip during his earliest years in this household, not in the fields where lashes were expected, but here, in polished halls, where Harrington himself once struck him for breaking a decanter. He remembers being denied rest while fever burned through his body. Harrington insisting he attend guests even as his legs trembled. He remembers the cold winter when scraps were withheld, the smell of roasted meat drifting into the servant quarters while he gnawed stale bread. Each memory has been a stone upon his chest, pressing him down, but in the silence of this night, the stones shift, rearranging themselves into a foundation. Above, the guests demand more wine, more courses, more of Elias. They do not know that every word, every order, is another thread pulled taut, tightening around their throats. He hears Lady Beatrice Harrow, her voice shrill and sweet as poisoned sugar, demanding he be sent to fetch her handkerchief, as though her own fingers might wither should they touch the fabric themselves. He knows her type well, remembers her laughter one autumn, when Harrington forced Elias to kneel in the garden mud and serve wine, as she and her companions giggled about the exotic dog pouring their drink. The cruelty of her mirth still rings in his ears, a cruelty laced with the delight of superiority. There is Sir Edmund Clark, whose insult earlier still burns in Elias's chest. Clark, who once brought Elias before a gathering to display a scar carved into his arm by raiders, treating it not as a wound, but as a curiosity, a grotesque tale to spice their conversation. Clark, who dined on suffering as easily as on sugared plums. Then there is Harrington's cousin, Lord Philip, with a face long and sallow, eyes like stagnant water. Philip is not loud, not brazen, but cruel in whispers, slipping coins into Elias's palm only to demand he bow lower, ordering impossible tasks and delighting in failure. Each guest has their brand of poison, and Elias knows them intimately, the way a hunter knows the patterns of prey. As the night deepens, the house grows hotter. Candle wax drips like molten pearls, pooling on polished wood. Perfume thickens the air. Mingled with sweat and roasted flesh, the guests' voices grow slurred, their laughter booming one moment, collapsing into bickering the next. Elias moves among them as commanded, his face a mask, his bow flawless, his voice clipped into servile tones. Yet within his chest, the ember roars, no longer a secret flicker, but a fire spreading into his veins. Each time he sets down a goblet, each time he accepts a sneer without flinching, he feeds the fire with patience. And then comes the betrayal that transforms patience into action. Harrington calls for silence, raising his glass high, the jewel on his ring flashing in the light. He announces to the table that tonight's entertainment shall not be merely music or cards, but something rarer, a display of loyalty. He commands Elias to step forward, to stand at the head of the table. The guests hush, leaning forward with flushed faces, eager for the spectacle. Harrington smirks, his teeth yellowed against the dark red of wine, and commands Elias to sing the song of his homeland. He says it mockingly, knowing Elias has been forbidden his tongue, forbidden the rhythm of his people. When Elias hesitates, Harrington strikes the table with his ringed fist, the sound a thunderclap across the hush. "Sing or crawl," he says, his voice thick with wine and cruelty. The silence that follows is unbearable. All eyes turn to Elias, eyes gleaming with cruel delight, eager to see him humiliated. Elias feels the fire in his chest surge to his throat. For a moment, he considers opening his mouth and unleashing the old words, not as performance, but as curse. Instead, he bows low, lower than ever before, his face hidden from their sight. In that bow, he hides the tremor of rage, the tears that sting but do not fall. When he straightens, he murmurs, "As you wish, my lord," and withdraws toward the kitchen. The guests laugh again, assuming victory. Harrington drains his glass, smug and satisfied. But Elias does not return with song. He returns with silence, and in that silence, a plan crystallizes. In the kitchen, he leans against the counter, his hands gripping the knife as though it were an anchor. The betrayal is complete. It is not just insult, but erasure, an attempt to strip from him the last fragment of his self. And in that stripping, they have given him permission to take what he has long withheld. The hours that follow are drenched in anticipation. He studies the guests more closely now, each cruelty etched into memory, each weakness noted. Lady Beatrice grows careless, dabbing wine from her lips with her sleeve rather than waiting for a cloth. Sir Edmund boasts louder, his words slurring, his laughter too booming, revealing the soft belly of arrogance. Philip watches from the corner, his eyes narrowed, his smirk faint but constant, the smirk of a man who believes he sees more than he does. And Harrington grows redder, sweat shining on his brow, his voice rising as he demands more indulgence, more proof of his supremacy. Elias feels the air change. The house groans beneath the weight of the storm gathering outside, wind pressing against the shutters, rain streaking against the glass. Lightning flares briefly, illuminating the dining room in stark white, shadows stretching grotesque across the walls. In that moment, Elias sees the table for what it truly is, not a symbol of power, but an altar. And upon that altar, sacrifice will be demanded. He moves through the motions of service, but inside he is sharpening more than steel. He sharpens resolve. He sharpens memory into weapon. His silence is no longer the silence of obedience. It is the silence of a hunter waiting for the right moment to strike. Each time a guest sneers, each time laughter rises, each time Harrington's voice cracks through the air, the moment draws closer. Elias feels it, the inevitability. The night is heavy with it, the air charged. The fire in the hearth snapping like bones breaking. Foreshadowing flickers in the small details. A goblet tips and spills across the tablecloth, spreading red like blood, and the guests laugh at the stain. Elias watches it spread, sees in it the vision of what is to come. The knife he carries from kitchen to table glints sharper in his hand, though none notice, for who would fear a servant? The music falters, one of the violinists missing a note, and the discordant sound lingers in the air like a warning. Elias withdraws once more into the kitchen, leaving the guests to their revelry. He leans against the counter, closes his eyes, and lets the fire inside consume him fully. He no longer questions whether he will act. The question now is how. He hears his grandmother's voice in memory, telling him of spirits who restore balance, of ancestors who walk beside the living, of justice that comes not when called, but when earned. He opens his eyes and sees the knife lying before him, reflecting his face in its polished steel. His expression is calm, composed, as though the storm outside were already within him, and now seeks only release. The betrayal has reshaped him. He is no longer the silent shadow of the Harrington household. He is the blade that has been hidden too long. He feels no fear, only certainty, the kind that hardens bones and steadies hands. Above him, the laughter continues. But soon that laughter will choke into silence. Soon the altar will be set, and the banquet will feed upon itself. Elias straightens, smoothing his uniform, tucking the knife close. He steps toward the door, the storm's howl rising with each breath, the shadows stretching long across the floor as though guiding him forward. The rising action is no longer rising. It is cresting, the tide surging to its peak. And when it breaks, it will break not upon Elias, but upon those who once called themselves masters. The banquet of horror is nearly ready to begin. The storm outside reaches its crescendo. Rain hammers against the windows of the Harrington estate, rivulets streaking the glass so heavily that the outside world disappears into a blur of shadow and water. Thunder bellows through the sky, each peal shaking the rafters, and lightning cracks in violent flashes that carve the dining room into stark relief. Jeweled rings glittering, goblets spilling, faces flushed with indulgence and arrogance. The guests ignore the storm, laughing louder, as though to challenge nature itself. Yet in the kitchen, Elias listens. He counts each thunderclap, each flicker of lightning, and maps it onto his plan. For tonight, nature does not oppose him. Tonight, the storm is his accomplice. He sharpens his resolve as carefully as he has sharpened the blade. His internal voice, once filled with questions, now flows like a steady current, unbroken. They demanded his silence. Now he will let silence be the weapon. No grand speech, no pleas for mercy. Only the calm, deliberate execution of justice. He sees each guest's face in his mind, each cruelty replayed, each transgression catalogued, and matches it with the method of reckoning that will come. This is no frenzy. This is choreography, a ritual of balance. He rehearses the steps as he prepares. Harrington is the head of the serpent, the bloated figure whose wealth and cruelty set the tone for all. His reckoning must be slow, methodical, personal, so that his end mirrors the weight of his dominance. Clark, loud and brutish, thrives on spectacle. His fall must strip him of bravado, reduce him to silence. Beatrice, the mocking aristocrat, will be brought face to face with her own vanity, her beauty rendered grotesque in the reflection of fear. Philip, the whisperer, must be cornered with no audience for his smirks, left to taste his own cowardice. And the others, minor guests, whose laughter sharpened the blades of insult, will feel the panic of prey caught in a trap. Elias steps into the hall again, carrying a tray of wine decanters. His expression is serene, his stride smooth. None suspect what stirs beneath his livery. Harrington roars with delight at his return, raising a hand to beckon him closer. "There's my loyal shadow," he declares, the words slurred, his cheek slick with sweat. Elias bows, setting the tray down, and in that bow conceals his eyes, which burn with quiet determination. When he straightens, he pours wine into Harrington's goblet, his hand steady, not a drop spilled. The storm outside crashes, thunder rattling the glass, and for a heartbeat, the guests fall silent, startled. Then laughter resumes, and with it, the final act begins. The first move is subtle. Elias lets the kitchen door remain ajar when he next retreats, the draft from the storm snuffing some of the candles in the dining room. Shadows lengthen, stretching across the walls like dark fingers. The guests grumble about the cold draft, but Harrington dismisses it with a wave, commanding Elias to mind the door later. Elias does not mind the door. He minds the blade, sliding it from beneath his coat, testing its balance in his palm as he waits. When he returns, his movements are a study in precision. He circles the table slowly, refilling goblets. His joado glides across the faces of the guests, his silence unsettling in the brief pauses between laughter. He begins with Clark. The man is flushed, boasting loudly about his trading empire, gesturing with greasy fingers. Elias leans to refill his glass, and in that moment, the knife flashes low beneath the tablecloth. A single swift thrust to the thigh. Deep enough to sever, hidden by the table's grandeur. Clark gasps, the sound half swallowed by the din of conversation. He clutches his leg beneath the table, eyes wide, but no one notices at first, assuming his sudden pallor is drunken stupor. Elias moves on, serene, pouring wine for Beatrice, who barely glances at him. Clark's voice falters, his boast dying in his throat as he slumps against the table, blood soaking into the fabric unseen. His silence is Elias's first victory. Beatrice's reckoning comes next. She has grown louder, her laughter shriller, as though competing with the storm. She dabs her lips with her sleeve, her once perfect composure dissolving under intoxication. Elias places her goblet before her, and as she lifts it to drink, he allows the knife to graze across the crystal rim, leaving a thin scar she does not notice. She drinks, and when she sets the goblet down, Elias lowers his gaze to meet hers. His eyes, calm yet unyielding, hold her attention. For the first time that night, she falters, her laughter catching in her throat. She sees something in his stare she cannot name, a mirror, perhaps, reflecting back not her beauty but her cruelty. Her hand trembles, and wine spills down her gown. The stain blossoms crimson, spreading like blood across silk. Panic flickers in her eyes, though she cannot explain it. Elias has not touched her flesh, but he has carved fear into her vanity. Philip, ever the whisperer, notices the change. His narrow eyes dart between Elias, Beatrice, and the slumped form of Clark, who now struggles to hide his wound. Philip's smirk wavers. He leans toward Harrington, murmuring suspicion. But Harrington, drunk and oblivious, waves him off, too consumed with his own indulgence. Elias notes Philip's unease and files it away. The coward is already unraveling. And then Harrington commands Elias closer once again. He slams his goblet onto the table, demanding more wine, more food, more entertainment. His jowls quiver with impatience, his voice booming. Elias steps behind him, the knife concealed in his sleeve, his breathing steady. For a moment, the entire room seems to still, the fire in the hearth crackling softly, the storm's howl pressing against the windows. Elias raises the blade, his shadow falling across Harrington's shoulders. But he does not strike yet. Justice for Harrington must not be swift. It must be deliberate. It must echo. Instead, Elias lets the blade rest momentarily against the edge of Harrington's goblet as he pours, scratching a faint mark into the glass. The sound is subtle, but Harrington jerks at it, glancing back with irritation. Elias bows smoothly, murmuring an apology, and Harrington scoffs, dismissing him. Yet the goblet now bears a scar, a reminder etched into crystal, foreshadowing the scar Elias will soon carve into Harrington himself. The tension thickens. Guests begin to sense unease. Clark's silence grows suspicious. Beatrice's trembling hand draws glances. Philip's darting eyes whisper of fear. Yet Harrington remains blind, too drunk, too arrogant to notice. Elias moves with increasing boldness now, his calm demeanor unshaken, his blade glinting in brief flashes, each movement a deliberate stroke of his ritual. He sets plates with precision, each clang of silver on china ringing like a tolling bell. The moment arrives in a swell of thunder. A lightning flash blinds the room for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, Elias acts. He drives the knife cleanly into Clark's chest beneath the table, the blade silencing the man's muffled groan. Blood blossoms against the fine fabric, spreading warmth that seeps into the wood. When the flash fades, Clark is slumped forward, his face pale, his boastful mouth slack. Silence ripples across the table as the guests register his collapse. Gasps erupt, chairs scrape back, voices cry out. Beatrice screams, high-pitched and ragged, her vanity dissolving into terror. Harrington bellows for order, slamming his fist, demanding Elias attend. But Elias does not obey. He stands at the head of the table now, the knife visible, glistening crimson. His posture is erect, his gaze steady, his silence absolute. For the first time, the guests see him not as a servant, but as something else entirely, the arbiter of their fate. Panic spreads like wildfire. Beatrice stumbles back, her gown dragging across the floor, her hands clawing at the stain as though she could erase it. Philip rises, trembling, stammering half-formed words, his smirk obliterated, his cowardice laid bare. Harrington rises too, rage contorting his features, shouting threats that ring hollow against the storm and the silence of Elias's resolve. The confrontation unfolds in deliberate beats. Elias advances first on Philip, whose whispers have always been venom in shadow. Philip retreats, knocking over his chair, stammering for mercy. Elias moves without haste, his knife steady, his steps measured. He corners Philip against the wall, and the man collapses, sobbing, his whispers now nothing but incoherence. Elias does not need to carve flesh. The sight of the blade alone has stripped Philip of every ounce of power. Elias leaves him crumpled, a shell of the man who once whispered cruelty. Beatrice's scream draws him next. She claws at the door, but the storm has blown it shut with such force that it will not yield. Elias closes the distance, her eyes wide, her powdered face streaked with tears. She begs, her voice breaking, her words tripping over themselves, but Elias only stares, silent, calm. He raises the knife to her cheek, letting the cold edge graze her skin without cutting. She whimpers, trembling, her beauty dissolving in fear. He lowers the blade, turns away, and in doing so, delivers the cruelest cut of all. He leaves her alive, forced to carry the memory of her fear as the truest reflection of herself. Now, only Harrington remains, the serpent's head. He roars, his face purple with fury, spittle flying. He seizes a carving knife from the table, brandishing it with clumsy rage. The guests shrink back, some sobbing, some frozen in shock. Elias faces him with unshaken composure. The storm's howl now his chorus. They circle the table, two figures locked in inevitability. Harrington lunges, his blade clattering against silverware, but Elias sidesteps, his movements precise, economical. He does not strike wildly. He waits. He watches Harrington's rage consume him, watches his footing falter, his breath heave. And when the moment is perfect, Elias strikes. A swift, clean thrust beneath the ribs. Harrington gasps, his eyes wide with disbelief, his knife clattering to the floor. Elias leans close, whispering nothing, for there are no words. Only silence. Harrington collapses, the master undone by the servant he never saw as man. The dining room is a tableau of horror. Guests sob, clutching each other, the storm's fury battering the windows. The table, once a symbol of wealth and indulgence, is stained with blood and fear. Elias stands amidst it all, his blade dripping, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. His calm remains unbroken, his resolve complete. He has delivered justice, not in frenzy, but in ritual, each act a mirror of the wrongs committed. The storm outside begins to soften, rain easing, thunder retreating. The night's crescendo has passed. The banquet of horror is complete. Elias turns, the knife still in his hand, and steps into the silence of the hall. His footsteps echo, steady, measured. Behind him, the guests remain frozen, their world shattered, their power dissolved. Ahead of him, the future waits, uncertain. But one thing remains certain. The name, Elias, once spoken only in command, will now be remembered in whispers of awe and terror. The night hung heavy with silence, as though the house itself was stunned by what had transpired, the walls trembling under the weight of screams, now forever extinguished. The butler stood alone in the center of the great dining room, the long mahogany table still lined with polished silver platters and crystal goblets, though their gleam now seemed grotesque, mocking in its splendor. The chandeliers above swayed gently, casting fractured light across the carnage he had orchestrated. The smell of roasted meats, claret wine, and dripping candle wax mixed with the iron sting of blood, forming a banquet of horror that no guest could have ever imagined. He breathed steadily, his chest rising and falling not with fear, but with a calm resignation, as though his long suppressed spirit had finally unshackled itself from invisible chains. In those moments after the final blade had struck, time itself felt strange, distorted, stretching like shadows at dusk. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting instant, he remembered the boy he had once been, dragged from the African coast, bound and branded, sold as though he were no more than livestock. He remembered the sun of his homeland, warm, golden, filling his lungs with freedom before the ships carried him across a cruel sea. That child's voice whispered within him now, not with sorrow, but with vindication. The child had never been given justice, but tonight, the man had carved it into existence with his own hand. Yet justice is never solitary. Its echoes spill outward, touching lives that neither asked for nor expected it. Soon the silence fractured. Footsteps thundered from above, servants awakened by muffled cries or drawn by the strange stillness of the evening. A maid, no older than 16, entered the hall with trembling lantern light. Her eyes widened at the sight, the lantern clattering to the floor, flames licking at the rug. She tried to scream, but the sound lodged in her throat like a stone, and all she managed was a broken gasp. Others followed. The cook, the scullery boys, wide-eyed and pale, crowding at the doorway like witnesses to an unholy ritual. The butler turned his head slowly toward them, his expression unreadable, knife still glistening in his grasp. For a moment, no one dared move. Then, as though awakened from a spell, they scattered, shrieking into the night, their cries climbing over rooftops and out into the cobbled streets of London. Soon the city would know. Soon carriages would arrive bearing officers of the law, their uniforms stiff with self-importance, their batons raised in trembling hands. The butler knew this with the certainty of a prophet. He did not flee. He did not hide. He placed the knife gently upon the table, aligning it beside a plate as though it were nothing more than another piece of cutlery, another instrument of service. He pulled a chair back, its legs scraping against the blood-slick floor, and sat at the head of the table, his master's seat. His back straight, his gaze unwavering, he waited. When the constables finally stormed through the grand double doors, their boots striking in unison like a drumbeat of authority, they expected chaos, resistance, some desperate animal cornered by its crimes. Instead, they found a man calm, composed, seated like a monarch at a coronation banquet. Behind him, the grotesque scene glimmered in candlelight. Every body a grim testament to his purpose. The officers hesitated. The youngest among them crossed himself in fear, whispering prayers beneath his breath. One demanded he stand. Another barked threats of violence should he resist, but he did not move until they laid their hands upon him. Even then, he rose with dignity, his wrists offered freely for shackles, his silence deeper than any plea. Dragged into the cold night, the butler felt the sting of winter wind against his sweat-damp skin. Crowds had already gathered, summoned by rumor, their faces pale, eager, horrified. They whispered words: murderer, savage, fiend. But their voices trembled, betraying awe as much as revulsion. For within each of them lingered the unspoken truth. He had done what none dared, turned the tables of power in a single, bloody night. He was no longer servant, no longer shadow. He was legend. The trial came swiftly, for such spectacles always demand public consumption. Newspapers seized upon the tale, their ink dripping with both sensationalism and prejudice. Illustrations depicted him as a monstrous figure, wild-eyed and barbaric, knife raised above trembling aristocrats. Yet others whispered differently in taverns and alleyways, their words carrying the weight of centuries of oppression. To them, he was not monster, but mirror, reflecting back the cruelties that polite society inflicted under gilded chandeliers. In the courtroom, he stood tall, his dark skin framed by the pale wigs and powdered faces of judges and barristers. The air was thick with the smell of ink, old wood, and the sweat of countless bodies packed into narrow benches. Witnesses wailed, describing horrors with quivering lips, yet none could deny the arrogance of the dead, the trail of suffering they had left in their wake. When asked to speak, the butler's voice rang steady, deep as thunder rolling across open plains. He did not beg forgiveness, nor weave excuses. He spoke of chains, of humiliation, of nights serving men who laughed at his pain, of years spent polishing silver that would never touch his lips. He spoke of silence forced upon him, and how silence, once broken, must roar. The words struck the court like hammers upon stone. Some spat in disgust, others wept quietly, unable to reconcile the figure before them with the stories printed in cheap broadsheets. Yet justice in the eyes of the law was rigid, unmoved by poetry or pain. He was sentenced to death, the punishment swift and unyielding, as though erasing him could erase the memory of what he had done. But legends are not so easily silenced. As the date of execution neared, the city pulsed with fever. Crowds gathered outside the prison, selling crude woodcuts of his likeness, whispering stories that blurred fact and invention. Some claimed he had summoned ancestral spirits to guide his hand. Others insisted he fed flesh to flesh, turning guests into unwilling cannibals, a symbolic inversion of centuries of consumption. Mothers hushed their children with warnings of the cannibal Butler, while young radicals toasted him as a symbol of uprising. He became both monster and martyr, his image carved into the imagination of London's people. On the morning of his execution, a gray mist blanketed the city, curling around cobblestones and muffling the sound of hooves and footsteps. The square was swollen with bodies, eager eyes straining for a glimpse of the man who had rewritten the boundaries of fear. Guards led him forth, chains clinking with each step. Yet he walked with a poise that unsettled even his captors. His eyes scanned the crowd, not with hatred but with something deeper, an unshakable recognition that he had become larger than himself, that his story no longer belonged to him alone. At the scaffold he paused, the rope dangling like an obscene ornament above his head. The executioner fumbled with knots, but the butler spoke, his voice carrying across the restless sea of faces. "I served," he said, each word deliberate. "I suffered, and now I stand." That was all. No pleas, no confessions, only truth distilled into 3 breaths of defiance. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some jeering, all forever marked by the sight of him standing tall in his final moment. When the trapdoor fell, silence gripped the square. A silence more terrible than any scream. Yet as his body stilled, his story surged outward, slipping through the cracks of empire and into the bloodstream of memory. Years turned to decades, but the cannibal butler's tale did not fade. It appeared in penny dreadfuls, his figure etched in lurid illustrations, with knives gleaming under moonlight. It lingered in whispered tales among servants who found in him a strange kind of hope, the dream that one day the oppressed might seize the table for themselves. Historians debated his reality, some insisting the story was exaggerated by papers hungry for scandal, others affirming the testimony of those who had seen the aftermath with their own eyes. Yet whether truth or myth, the essence remained. A man had risen from shadow to carve his name upon the very fabric of power. And so he became more than man, more than crime. He became warning and inspiration, horror and hymn. The cannibal butler, they called him, though his true feast had been justice served to those who believed themselves untouchable. His knife cut deeper than flesh. It carved open the illusions of civility, exposing the rot beneath polished silver and velvet drapes. Even now, centuries later, his story endures, whispered in the hush of candlelit rooms, invoked in novels and plays, studied in classrooms where history wrestles with morality. Some recoil in terror, others nod with solemn recognition, all compelled to ask the same question. When those who suffer finally rise, what price will justice demand? And perhaps that is why we tell his tale still, across time, across oceans, across cultures. Not for gore, not for shock, but for the reminder that silence has limits, that power can provoke reckoning, that history is written not only by kings and lords, but by the hands of those who served them. His story is a mirror held up to society, daring us to see what lurks behind the glitter of chandeliers and the clinking of glasses. This is the banquet he left us, and we are all still seated at the table. So now, I ask you, how do you judge him? Was he monster or martyr? Horror or hero? That choice, dear listener, is yours to decide.